Увага, ми стартуємо. Наша школа буде двомовна. Переважно хто з українських учасників будуть говорити з нами українською, але теж будуть англійські сесії, англомовні сесії. Сьогодні якраз цей випадок, so I switch to English. Welcome everybody to the summer school which has this beautiful title, Gaining Voice in Time of War, Debate, Culture, Media and Institutions in Post-February 22, Ukraine and Beyond. Here I need to make some small comment. It's a bit different since this title frames a specific focus which is mainly developed in Budapest. They will have more discussions on political culture, more discussions on how to talk, how to write. And this school will have more focus, though we share the same title, but the school will have more focus on historical voices. So we will look for various voices, and we keep it in brackets. Voices as metaphors, voices as reality. So we will talk a lot about this. So in this regard, this campus, Lviv campus, would be a bit different from Budapest campus. So please don't be disappointed. We are different, but though we are on the same umbrella. And welcome those who were with us last year. You already encountered that we focused more on practical, let's say, sessions. We will have, again, practical session with analyzing moving images, not static images. Last year we had a photograph. We will talk about various possibilities to interpret, to gain voice, to give voice, how we read, how we write. We will have a session of more precise reading. So in Budapest they will have a session on writing, and we will have a session on reading, and so on. So you have programs in your folders, and here I will just read this part. So the school aims to explore the historical instances of gaining agency, ethnic, gender, national, not only by examining past examples, but also by amplifying the voice of the young generation of Ukrainian intellectuals and professionals. So this is our focus. So we will kind of shuffle between past history and contemporaneity. If everything will be fine, because we are living through the very kind of unpredictable situation. So one thing is that you plan, another thing that happens. Tomorrow we plan to go to the Jam Factory to see the exhibition, though it depends on the electricity switches. And if there will be no light, probably they will not give us access to this exhibition since it's very mediatized. So we expect to have until the end of this day a report, and Sofia will get the new, they renew every week electric switches in each district of Lviv, and we will know whether electricity is there or not in the morning. And then we will make the final decision. Most probably we will go, even if they will not give us access. We will see the region, this district, sorry, we will walk through the Jam Factory, and probably the difference might be that whether we will have a talk with Katarina Botanova here or there, because the idea was that we go on exhibit. She asks us to pay specific attention to what we see on this exhibit. This exhibit is specifically connected to the issues of gender, art, voices, and agency, and this is very interesting, and war also. But we will see. So there might be shifts in the program, that I warn you, but more or less everything here is under control. So now there is no electricity, and we have electricity, so we have all the possibilities. The cat is still with us, those who remember from the last year. Those who don't know, this is Mushka, the part of the team, and she will help you to run through the school smoothly, and she will help you to accommodate more to our sessions. We will have also one more trip, which will be exciting trip to Podhirci. Those who don't know, this is the castle not far from Lviv, and there is a beautiful exhibition of two Odessa artists there, and this is a nice decaying place with decaying exhibitions, and we will talk there about specific issues related to war, art and documents and history, how actually such things can be sources for historians and so on. So except sessions, practical sessions, discussions, roundtable, individual mentoring sessions, we will have these travels, trips and walks like today. This is probably everything I wanted to say you by now. We will have a bit more time on the program tomorrow. So we meet at 9:30 here and then we leave to the, okay, we will tell you. So we meet 9:30 here. I will tell you more about the program. And today we have pleasure, and this is my honor, to welcome Professor Puttkamer, who came to us specifically to deliver this lecture to you. So he crossed the border by feet, and he had to find all these kind of specificities of Ukrainian-European border crossing in times of war to talk to you. Professor Puttkamer is a specialist in the history of Eastern Europe. In 2000, in the year of 2000, he habilitated his project. In English, it sounds the Hungarian nationality problem of the 19th century in everyday school life. Before receiving his PhD in 1994, Professor von Puttkamer studied modern Eastern European history in Freiburg and London. His publications include East Central Europe in the 19th century and 20th century. He published in the Gruyter, Routledge, Oldenburg, and he also produced monographs and in various series related to this region specifically. He's fluent in languages of the region, and currently Professor Puttkamer serves as director of the Imre College in Jena, and he is there already for 12 years as director. Yes, and he holds the chair of Eastern European History of the Friedrich Schiller University of Jena. Professor von Puttkamer, sorry, this is because of heat, is a big friend of Ukraine. He helps a lot. His institution also was involved in gaining funds for UFO, and Jena was among the big sponsors. We also cooperate in the way to produce historical sources for courses that are taught at UFO, and in general Professor von Puttkamer is very well aware of what is going on here, so you don't have to preach or convince him, yes, but I encourage you to talk to Professor Puttkamer later on to establish maybe also direct contacts, or if you want to have direct consultations, please do not hesitate, okay? And the floor is yours, and we will have a lecture which relates to the, I will not recall the full title, but which relates to the, again, voices, democracy, and 19th century after big revolutions.
Thank you. The title is Voices of Democracy, Eastern Europe since 1848. So this is the session about listening, which is, I know, a challenge after such a long and warm day. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you also to Sofia Andrusichin for organizing this. It's actually for 2 years now I've been here and there involved behind the scenes supporting Ostap Sereda, who was, when he started getting involved with Invisible University in Jena at our institute, and also helping some of the CEU people. We have, I think, over the 2 years, have had some 600–700 Invisible University students, and it's a great pleasure to meet some of you in person now. So I'm really happy to be here. What I'm going to try to do today is to introduce you a little bit along voices into some of the main motives of the history of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. As you all know, Eastern Europe seems to be the region where liberal democracy looks particularly fragile. There's a vast body of literature on the populist and authoritarian challenges in Hungary, Viktor Orban, and in Poland, on how the Orban government controls the media to build what is called a mafia state, and how Jarosław Kaczynski and his party dismantled the independent judiciary in Poland and undermined the rule of law. As we also all know, Hungary and Poland are not unique, not in the region and not in general. There might be a silver lining to democratic backsliding, at least in Poland, since the elections last year, but one could easily add Slovakia or very recently Georgia to this list, maybe also Romania. I won't go into the details. Much of the political science literature which we have on this issue, particularly when rooted in the transition paradigm of the 1990s, assumes that liberal democracy is particularly fragile in Eastern Europe because it presumably never had a chance to take deep roots in the region, given the history of imperial partitions, authoritarianism, Nazi and Soviet occupation. I've heard earlier that some of you are working on the imperial history of the region, so you know what I'm talking about. This boils down to the argument seen from the West that Eastern Europeans show authoritarian leanings because they are politically not mature. Liberal philosopher Ralph Dahrendorf famously argued in 1990 in an anonymous letter to Warsaw, with a glance on Poland, that it would take at least one generation for civil society and its values to grow, maybe two. Now I'm trying to highlight this argument because I'm a bit wary of it. It is condescending, it smacks of essentialism, which I don't find very convincing. And being from Germany, I know that democracy can take roots after some time, and that it doesn't have much deeper roots in Germany than in most of the regions east of Germany. I found it very interesting that Kyiv social scientist Larissa Tamilina only recently made an argument to the contrary. In Ukraine, she argues, the historical experience of oppression, fragmentation, and political resistance fostered the commitment to democratic values rather than weakening it. This might be difficult to prove in an empirically sound way, but so is the essentialist argument which she is working up against. One could, of course, add that in recent years we have learned that democratic backsliding is by far not limited to the young democracies of Central and Eastern Europe. Think of books like Stephen Levitsky's and Daniel Ziblatt's seminal How Democracies Die, on the silent erosion of democratic norms and institutions, particularly in the United States. Democracies die at the ballot box, they argue, which makes me rather nervous about the current elections in France. And not least of all in my own home region in Thuringia, which I do in September. And the right-wing authoritarian, partly fascist party is polling, in opinion polls, is running first. These developments and debates, of course, trouble me as a historian, and they make me think more about the cultural roots, cultural basis of democracy in general, and in Eastern Europe in particular. Eastern Europe, or Central and Eastern Europe in the American terminology, roughly understood as Poland, Ukraine, and their neighbors, is the region, as you heard, where I can claim some historical expertise. Whether I can claim fluency in all the languages is a question of how you define fluency, but that's a different issue. I am interested in language, though, particularly in the political language of democracy, and about the roots of democracy in everyday life. As a historian, I think that if one wants to understand how liberal democracy is socially embedded, it's not enough to look at institutions, party systems, or political values. One should rather conceive of democracy as a process, as a fragile process, a practice which is as much situational as it is value-driven, as much rooted in voices as in institutions, and all too often falling short of its promises. So in the following, what I'm trying to do is not to give a comprehensive history of East European democracy, and certainly not a chronological one. I would rather like to unfold some observations from the margins of mainstream political language and see how these voices add to the debates which I just briefly outlined. Listening to these voices might give some hints at what Eastern Europeans expected from democracy in their times, in the mid-19th and early 20th century, and how this might inform and deepen our present understanding, which will hopefully also add to the topic of this summer school. I will first speak a little bit about the revolutions of 1848 and the birth pangs of Eastern European constitutionalism and radically understood at the time democracy. Then I will look at democracy's social promises and new beginnings in the aftermath of the First World War. I will examine notions of Russia as an external other to democracy, which seems to be a peculiar feature of the region. And finally, I will discuss democracy as a call for trust, confidence, and the promise of a moral order. And you will hear all these motives already being voiced in the earlier parts of my lecture. So what I will try to argue is that there are indeed some unique or specific features of East European democracy which might explain some of its strength as much as its fragility. I will also try to demonstrate that there's much to learn from Eastern European democratic beginnings for a more deeper and more general understanding of what liberal democracy might be about. So let me start with 1848. Freedom, and particularly freedom of speech, was one of the key slogans in the very first days of the 1848 revolution. Constitution was the other one. Within days after Emperor Ferdinand had granted both freedom of speech and a constitution in his manifesto of March 13th, cities big and small throughout the Habsburg monarchy were flooded with quickly printed pamphlets, sort of the social media of their times. And you can see all of them digitized in a Vienna library. Wien Bibliothek is the URL. Everyone could now speak out. The multitude of voices was overwhelming, and for some it threatened to spin out of control. Many of these were pamphlets, many were poems, songs, quickly composed, not of very high quality, literary quality, but interesting. A Viennese rhymester saw the golden allegory of freedom rising from the ashes like a phoenix, and the nations trustfully embracing each other in tears. Another song praised the newly won harmony between the monarch and his people. Students in Vienna conjured doom and death upon tyranny and rhymed freedom and law with bloody battle, which in German it rhymes Recht and Gefecht. These were the more militant spirits. We are free, sighed another pamphleteer, and then warned the students not to become boisterous, not to overstretch their claims. He argued that the wheel of history had turned so suddenly that it now called for moderation, and most of all, for mutual trust. Trust in the wise men that were now to be elected to the Constitutional Assembly, and trust in the monarch who had gracefully lifted oppressive censorship. These were the less militant and more moderate voices. The burghers of Ljubljana struck a different key. They sent an address to Vienna and reported how joyfully the freedom-loving Slovene fatherland had greeted the news from Vienna, and thus asserted a Slovene fatherland which had been hitherto rather unheard of in Vienna, that it existed at all. In a similar vein, but much more outspoken, Leon Sławkowski from Lviv here hailed the Viennese students for having been the first in Eastern Europe to break the ground for the dawn of freedom, which would now enlighten the world, only to add that now was the time to fight down Asian despotism and the Mongolian spirit, and to restore Polish statehood. Let me go through some of these motives one by one. It is rather common knowledge that in Eastern Europe the promise of individual freedom and constitutionalism almost immediately translated into the call for national equality, national emancipation, with partly fatal consequences. Fatal in the short run, productive, you can say, in the very long run. In Prague, Czech deputies connected the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of religion, and the promise of a constitution in March 1848 with the call for the unification of the Bohemian lands, their representation of the Bohemian lands in a unified diet, which should become a parliament, and full equality of the Czech language. In Hungary, a couple of weeks later, the Slovak National Assembly, and there was no Slovak fatherland from a Viennese or Budapest perspective at that time, the Slovak National Assembly followed suit. The Slovak delegates argued that condemning the Slovak population to silence would mean to slander the holy word freedom, and called for a Slovak regional diet with full national rights. Serbs and Romanians put forth similar demands. And so did the Ukrainians in Lviv. The Supreme Ruthenian Council, you probably all heard this in elementary school, I don't know, or maybe secondary school, is well known for proclaiming that the Ruthenes of Galicia formed one nation with their brethren in Tsarist Russia. This was an act of future-oriented political self-assertion. It was not an outright political program, certainly not for the time being. The Council's key demand, if one looks through the entire program, was the commitment to elevate the Ukrainian nation by cultivating its language and safeguarding its constitutional rights. Brothers, trust us Ruthenes, the Supreme Council in Lviv concluded its proclamation, and I quote, because only by these means, that is, building the nation, we can become an honorable, enlightened and free nation. So for the Ruthenes, or Ukrainians of their time in Lviv, freedom, first of all, was a call for nation building. Forging a Ruthenian or Ukrainian nation came with the need to fend off competing Polish aspirations. Leon Sławkowski from Lviv was not the only Polish revolutionary to call for the resurrection of Poland, and what he had in mind was the historical borders of 1772, or maybe even more. So I quote another programmatic leaflet or pamphlet of the Supreme Ruthenian Council. Yes, Poles want to be free, but exclusively, so as to freely suppress subordinated nations and even their own people. That was a memorandum written in German in July 1848 and addressed to international readers. And the quote goes on, this Polish freedom is not to our taste. Therefore we want to side with constitutional Austria, where we hope to find the prosperity which a state grounded on liberal institutions can offer. So far as to uniting with the Ruthenes on the other side of the Tsarist border, they were going with Austria. In the early days of the 1848 revolution, freedom had joyfully been greeted as a unifying force, nations trustfully embracing each other in tears, but within a couple of weeks, this idea of national freedom became divisive. The question is, how could this happen? The declaration of the Ruthenian Supreme Council, to me, gives an important clue. By calling to build a nation which would find prosperity, it spelled out a task which lay ahead throughout the Habsburg monarchy, namely to turn subjects into citizens. For this, one needed to prevent the landholding elites from keeping their grips on the peasants, either by bridging a cultural gap between peasants and landholders, as the Hungarian nobility thought it did by graciously expanding their property rights to the peasants, or, the other option, by strengthening awareness among the peasants of their newly won political position, as the Ruthenian Council did, as one case in point. What I'm trying to argue is that the national idea did not necessarily eclipse the idea of freedom from its very inceptions. There are many voices that allow for various readings. Take, for example, the Hungarian Declaration of Independence from April 1849. Its opening words implored the natural, inalienable rights of the Hungarian nation. This wording is clearly modeled on the American Declaration of Independence, but for Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, it was men, not nations, who held inalienable rights. And I quote the American Declaration, you all know it, among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For Lajos Kossuth, who sort of copied this, the Hungarian nation held these rights, and its individual members, as such, more or less followed suit. For those who knew, the American model was clearly still visible in the wording of the Hungarian Declaration, even though it took a different turn. Or take, for another example, the leading Viennese liberal Adolf Fischhof. In January 1849, as a member of the Kremsier Constitutional Assembly, the Austrian Parliament turned Constitutional Assembly, he lamented, and I quote Fischhof, "For all too long," that's my translation by the way, "For all too long we quarreled over freedom's golden fruit skin, which is nationality, yet in quarreling over the skin we lost freedom's kernel." End of quote. This image in my reading nicely hints at a tension between nationality and freedom, but it does not fully play them out against each other. Fischhof rather highlighted the dangerously enticing appeal of what was essentially part of freedom, fully understood, the whole fruit with skin and kernel. Political leaders in Central and Eastern Europe appealed to the sweet skin of nationality in 1848 because they felt they needed to reach out to the general populace, to the urban population, where the language of nation and nationality had already won some ground before the revolution, and to the peasants, where in large parts of the monarchy it had not. Among East European peasants, nationalist feelings were not particularly strong at the time, quite to the contrary. The peasants needed to be elevated to full citizenship, and they needed to be convinced that this was the task for the promise of a bright future in the dawning era of free peoples to come true. And the liberal nationalists, as in the Supreme Ruthenian Council, knew that if they didn't win over the peasants with this program, somebody else would, like Poles or Germans, or nobody would, and then they would fall back and prey to the reaction, and all might be lost. So much as the connection between individual and national freedom in 1848. In Eastern Europe, that's the second part of my argument, democracy came with the promise of social emancipation to a much more intense degree than it did elsewhere in Europe. I could now spend another half an hour or so speaking about the prominent role which the abolition of robot and peasant emancipation played during the 1848 revolutions, from the very first days until the very end of the revolutions, and about the peculiar twists, by the way, here in Eastern Galicia. What I find more interesting, though, is the fact that the promise of far-reaching agrarian reform, no longer peasant emancipation, but cutting up noble estates, returned at the end of World War I. Starting with the February Revolution in Russia, revolutionary governments, democratically minded, promised land to the peasants and linked the newly won democracy directly to this promise. Take, for example, Czechoslovakia. Within months of the proclamation of this new country, this new state, the new republic decided to expropriate the noble estates, which were particularly prominent in Bohemia and the Bohemian lands, and distribute them to the landless population. I quote the social democratic leader Antonín Němec, "Our agrarian reform is one of the biggest efforts ever in this field." And he continued, "Only a strong state can take on such a reform, and we can draw our strength only from our independence and our democracy." Another quote, "There is no democratization without nationalization of the soil." One of the leaders of the Agrarian Party joined in. Rest of the quote, "Therefore, taking away the great land holdings is for us the categorical imperative of democratization." End of quote. Land reform was about winning the trust of the peasants, and it was, one could say, again, about building new and capable institutions. The revolutionaries of 1848 had believed that they could do away with serfdom by a mere stroke of the pen. In the following years, after the end of the revolution, the Austrian bureaucracy cleared up the mess, and it did so quite successfully. Now, 70 years later, East Europeans were well aware of the fact that they needed a strong state to enact the promised reforms, and this time it should be their own nation state. And you can trace this thought all the way to the Ukrainian Central Rada's first universal from June 1917, which was built precisely on this premise. And I quote from the first universal, by the way, do you read this in school?
Yes.
The universals, you do. So that should be familiar. And here I can draw on the English translation by Taras Hunchak. We desire that after all the lands throughout Russia held by the nobility, the state, the monasteries, and the Tsar have been confiscated and have become the property of the people, the right to administer the Ukrainian lands shall belong to us, to our Ukrainian assembly. So it's the claim to have a grip, or say at least, in the institutions that would enact these reforms. This motive echoes through subsequent documents all the way to the Fourth Universal. Next to proclaiming Ukrainian independence, as you all know, it called to establish local administrations, I quote, which can be trusted. And it promised that legislating the expropriation of noble estates was a matter of days. From 1917 to 1919, building trustworthy democratic institutions that could answer popular expectations was a race against time. And for the time being, the Ukrainians lost this race to the Bolsheviks, which allowed the peasants to basically do it themselves without institutions, and then build the institutions afterwards to expropriate them again. In Czechoslovakia of April 1919, the prospect that Bolshevism might win over the masses in Czechoslovakia and sweep away the democratic revolution was actually quite real. The Hungarian Soviet Republic was just next door. Millions of demobilized soldiers returned home after years of fighting or after years of captivity in Russia, and they knew Bolshevism from first sight. They had been promised a better life in reward for war's mortal perils, and now this promise had to be kept. It was clear that the old social order had outlived its time. Politicians clearly spelled out the link between war, democracy, and social reform. I quote again Antonín Němec from his speech in Parliament when he opened the debate on the agrarian reform. Němec said, "The World War has started for purely imperialist reasons. It has then turned into a war for national liberation, and now the great movement for social liberation joins in." That's April 1919. But social liberation throughout the region was not limited to agrarian reform. The new democracies of the region made far-reaching promises as to labor legislation, social security, and, of course, women's suffrage. Based on such promises, liberal democracy was a means of addressing the strains of war and of coping with its consequences. Once the dark cloud of Bolshevism had passed and the immediate memory of the war began to wane in the mid-20s, conservative and authoritarian forces in most of the countries of the region gained the upper hand, partly even in Czechoslovakia, but that's a different debate. Democracy as a response to coping with the strains of war is a pattern which returned at the end of World War II, though under well-known different auspices. Radical change and the elimination of those social formations which had caused the war, or seemed to have caused the war, seemed the only possible answer to unseen horrors. But this time, the communists indeed won over, partly with the massive support of the Red Army and the Soviet NKVD, and partly also because the promise they offered was the most radical one after the most radical experience of Nazi occupation, terror and genocide. I'm not going to go deeper into the post-World War II experience, but I do think that this somewhat general observation of democracy being linked with the promise of post-war massive social reform does have some consequences for our understanding of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe and of the history in democracy in general. In Eastern Europe, one could argue democracy did not come gradually, it came as a flight forward with the promise of radical change. The advent of democracy was situational, that is driven by an imminent sense of crisis, as much as it was driven by a long-standing commitment to fundamental democratic values. Thus, it faced the prospect of disappointment, not just once, but twice, maybe even 3 times. This is, of course, this threat of disappointment, not an essential feature of Eastern European democracies, but it is an experience of the region which I think we have to reckon with. My third point, the external other, that is Russia. Eastern European democracies took shape in the shadow of Russia. This is something which struck me particularly in going through many of the leaflets. In 1919, of 1848, the leaflets of 1848, in 1919, the threat of Bolshevism, as just mentioned, was obvious, but I want to briefly return to the voices of 1848. Because if one listens to them, one notices quickly that Russia then had loomed large on the minds of East European democratic revolutionaries already 2 generations before the end of the First World War. This is, of course, particularly salient, again, with Polish revolutionaries. Their pamphlets, I quoted Sławkowski already, reveled in the prospect of imminent war against barbaric Asian despotism and the Mongolic spirit. Now was the time to fight a war of salvation. As early as March 1848, one pamphlet fantasized a free Germany united with Austria, crushing Russia and swinging a victorious knout in Moscow. Another pamphlet, which first appeared in Krakow and then was translated from Polish into German and reprinted in Vienna, featured a fake will by Tsar Peter the Great. Russia, this fake will read, should sow discord throughout Europe and keep its soldiers busy, always lying in wait for an opportunity to attack. Another pamphlet read that the beacons of freedom would drive the enslaved Russian people back into the inhospitable steppe. When reads such pamphlets, even in peaceful Germany, they do read somewhat eerie, since motives in there, and that's why I quote them, resonate till the present day. But what I want to say here is not that they're very topical, but that already in the early days of the 1848 revolution, Russia was imagined as the external other of democratic freedom, complementary to tyranny or anarchy in the inside as internal others. And Russia was envisaged as the natural seat of tyranny. And in a triumphant spirit, it was not to be feared, but to be crushed. And yet, if one goes through the voices of 1848, Russia waging war against Russia was not the only option that was on the table. More careful voices developed the idea of a renewed Habsburg monarchy as a union of free peoples, as a bulwark of Europe and civilization itself against Russia's despotism and against Russia's aspirations to expand without bounds. The most famous voice here, obviously, was the Czech František Palacký, who warned as a professing Slav in his famous letter to the Frankfurt Parliament, where the Germans had invited him to take part as a Bohemian in building German democracy. He warned against the dangers of a Russian universal monarchy, and I quote, "Assuredly, if the Austrian state had not existed for ages, it would have been in the interests of Europe and indeed of humanity to endeavor to create it as soon as possible." That's a famous quote. But Franz Schuselka, a German liberal, formulated a similar idea, only in less proverbial words, when he spoke of Austria as the great bulwark of education and freedom for all its peoples, including the freedom-loving Slavs. And I quote Schuselka, "The freedom-loving Slavs, they want to remain Austrians so as not to become Russians." We already heard a faint echo of these ideas with the Supreme Ruthenian Council, and I quote it again, "We Ruthenes want to side with constitutional Austria, where we hope to find the prosperity which a state grounded on liberal institutions can offer." End of quote. Now, the relationship between Russia and East European democracies is more complex than simple dichotomies and much more ambivalent. In 1908, Polish politician Roman Dmowski, not precisely a democratic voice, but yet I want to quote him, was among the first to spell out the vision of a Russia that would throw off bureaucratic rule, emancipate society, and guarantee full equality to all its people as a precondition of national renewal. National and liberal-minded Polish and Czech intellectuals of the time shared the tension between the emphatic embrace of a future liberated Russia and, again, its total rejection as a stronghold of tyranny. The four universals of the Ukrainian Central Rada mirror this ambiguity in a trajectory throughout all four of them. While the first, and even more so the second universal, implore the unity of Russian and Ukrainian democratic forces, they also speak of the need to assert Ukrainian statehood so as to meet revolutionary Russia at eye level. Not Russia herself, but Bolshevism prompted the Central Rada to declare full independence in January 1918. In Eastern Europe, aspirations at democracy were nearly always overshadowed by perceptions of Russia in one way or the other. In a different article, we can go into this in the debate, in the Q&A section if you want, I argued, or I tried to argue at least, that democracy in Germany is partly shaped by its relation to Poland, and vice versa. The same goes for the relation between Eastern Europe and Russia. Russia is the external other to East European democracy. Germany, in part, is as well, particularly for Poles. And we can go deeper into this. What I'm trying to say is that when we think of democracy, we have to think maybe in a more transnational perspective than looking at national trajectories. Building democracy in Eastern Europe rests on this relationship to the monstrously large neighbor. It's built on armed self-assertion, on seeking association with one's democratic neighbors, on hoping for democratic change within Russia herself, whatever this might look like, or a combination of all. This constellation, it seems to me, dates back to the middle of the 19th century. That is, it is as old as democratic thinking in Eastern Europe itself, and it might be as salient a feature as a link between democracy, nationalism, and sweeping social reform. And they are, in a way, all connected. My watch is running slowly, or I'm talking fast. Yeah. My fourth point, a few words on trust and democracy as a moral order. Brothers, trust us Ruthenians. The Supreme Ruthenian Council in Lviv had concluded its proclamation of May 10, 1848, because only by these means we can become an honorable, enlightened and free nation. Trust, as I read it, had become a key slogan during the early month of the 1848 revolution. Particularly telling is a proclamation to Austria's peoples, which the Austrian Imperial Parliament issued while still in Vienna on October 7, 1848. The author was the Assembly's Vice President, Franciszek Jan Smolka, a Polish-Austrian lawyer, also from Lviv. I think he had a German father and a Hungarian mother, which made him a Pole. The day before, a rioting crowd had blocked the departure of troops for Hungary, had stormed the arsenal and gained the weapons, murdered the Minister of War, Latour, and taken control of the city. The Emperor had fled to Olomouc. It was a pivotal moment of the 1848 revolution. According to Smolka's proclamation, the Imperial Parliament had stepped in both against anarchy and reaction. It reminded its audience of the great task to build a new constitutional order and called for active political prudence. Peoples of Austria, it read, your trust has summoned us. Your trust has summoned us, and it is only by your trust that we are strong. Let us unwaveringly respect the law, the constitutional monarchy, and freedom. End of quote. 1 week later, radical Viennese students issued a similar call, now addressed to the peasants. Their freedom, which the peasant emancipation law had proclaimed just 2 months earlier, now seemed to be at stake. And the Viennese students called out to the peasants, and I quote, your common sense will tell you whom to trust. And they called for the peasants to join an armed struggle, which already became desperate in Jena and was soon lost. So we see in this situation of crisis, the appeals for trust came in different contexts. The Ruthene Supreme Council had vied for political allegiance. Smolka had called for trust to calm down the Viennese crowd, while the Viennese students wanted to mobilize the peasants for armed action in defense of endangered freedom. Ever since, confidence and trust have been recurrent motives of the language of constitutionalism and parliamentary democracy. Another quote, we can firmly trust that our difficult task in building true democracy will be crowned with success. This is Czech politician Karel Kramář when he concluded his opening speech of the Czechoslovak Constitutional Assembly in November 1918. And you can find similar words in the Polish Constitutional Sejm of 1921. As already quoted, the Fourth Universal of the Central Rada calls to establish such local administrations which can be trusted and which will be based on all revolutionary democratic strata of the people. during these last final weeks of 1917 and early weeks of 1918, trust in the bodies of local self-government and the local institutions was the last resort to stem the tide of Bolshevism in Ukraine. 3 generations later, the preamble to the Ukrainian Declaration of Independence of August 24, 1991, called to normalize Ukraine's internal situation after the attempted Moscow coup a month before, and, I quote, to raise the trust of the Ukrainian nation in the Verkhovna Rada and its presidency. Looking at all these appeals across the century, or 1.5 centuries, one sees that trust and confidence are openly voiced or appealed to in ceremonial moments of new beginnings and in moments of crisis, in defense of those institutions that were tasked with building democracy and with effecting long-term reform, and as the precondition for social betterment. If one looks at political science literature, which is not precisely my field, one sees a slightly different perspective. Political scientists, maybe some are in the room, they measure trust by opinion polls. And their results show a somewhat different picture. In a survey among European EU citizens from March 2023, a majority trusted citizens and civil society organizations most when it comes to defending democracy, and much less so political parties, politicians, and the media. One can also find similar patterns in Ukraine. A recent survey from February 24 shows that Ukrainian citizens might trust their government less than Russian citizens do, but they more firmly put trust in civic activism and in the capacity of democracy to solve political problems. This is in line with more general opinion polls which see Ukraine ranking quite high in trusting democracy as the relatively best form of government and their country being run according to the will of the people. There seems to be a remarkable and maybe somewhat disquieting gap between trust, which both Europeans and Ukrainians, they all put in democracy in general, and less so in democracy's key institutions. Such opinion polls also show that trust is not unique to democracy, quite to the contrary. Polish political scientist Michał Puś in 2013 concluded from a statistical survey of 54 states that confidence in the government is a typical feature more of authoritarian regimes, while democracies require, that's his argument or his finding, democracies require a certain element of civic distrust and criticism to sustain democracy. So too much trust in democracy and its institutions might also have its flip side. This finding is quite in line with political theory. Trust must not be blind, and trusting society, trusting our fellow citizens is as essential to the workings of democracy as trusting its institutions might be. So let me conclude. Since the revolution of 1848, we see liberal constitutionalism with a democratic tendency, as one deputy to the Viennese parliament remarked. We see liberal constitutionalism as a promise to pacify an agitated society, outlining a space of law, equality and freedom, a space where social conflict is peacefully resolved, or at least peacefully moderated. As militant as some of the voices I quoted might have been, they mostly conceive of democracy as a space of civilized conduct and a retreat from physical violence. A space not of unrestrained freedom, but of organized liberty. In this respect, democracy becomes visible not as an institutional setup, but as a moral commitment and maybe a moral challenge. This might sound familiar to some of you from political theory. In practice, as mirrored in political language, this understanding of democracy as a moral commitment and a moral challenge seems to me to be particularly deeply rooted in parts of Central and Eastern Europe. Because in here, it is historically linked to new beginnings, to far-reaching promises of freedom and social betterment against all odds. It promised to build nations as moral communities, to overcome social cleavages, and to link the anonymous, maybe amorphous urban and rural masses to the elected and sometimes self-proclaimed representatives. Democracy, more often than in Western Europe, came as the answer to the experience of war, and always aware of its threatening neighbor to the east, and for Poles and Czechs, also the threatening neighbor from the west. From 1989 and 1991 onwards, democracy promised to mend the moral distortions of communist rule, be it in the spheres of birth control and abortion, of replacing compromised local party elites, of illustrating state officials for their involvement with state security services, of putting national history back into its place, its rightful place, and last but not least, in rethinking freedom and security in the economic sphere. The call for trust links all these salient features. It is the bedrock of democracy in Eastern Europe, particularly where state institutions are relatively weak. At the beginning of my lecture, I quoted Ralph Dahrendorf on the notion that civil society and its values would need at least 1 or 2 generations to grow in Eastern Europe, and I criticized this notion for being condescending. People do not need to mature, particularly not adult people. Yet with time, democracy's initial promise to change things for the better, which I tried to outline here as a salient East European experience, this promise is either fulfilled or exhausted, if not disappointed. And from then on, people, mature people, have to trust their elected representatives and their democratic institutions for different reasons than making promises of a new beginning. It is this shift from a far-reaching promise to an everyday expectation which needs to be accommodated after 1 or 2 generations. So one could say it's democracy which needs to mature. And as we know from historical experience, it failed to do so several times. Being from Germany, I know that it's not specific to Eastern Europe. So when listening to East European voices, we learn to conceive of democracy as a space of mutual trust, of trust in the power of pluralism in a civilized space, particularly in times of war. And this call for mutual trust, I'm well aware, asks quite a lot from us. But in the end, that's what I'm trying to argue, that is what democracy is all about. Thank you.
I think we can work without the mic, and Sophia is out, so we don't have a mic. But everyone hears, and the voice is recorded from the camera. So I'm happy to open the floor for questions or comments, and please raise your hand and if you have some particular remarks.
Thank you, Professor von Puttkamer. I would like to ask about who was under these voices of democracy, except for the nationalists, because it's usually like this question of land, question of peasants. These questions were like under the rule of nationalists, of early nationalists of Ukraine in 1849, Eastern Galicia, and in the big Ukraine in the Russian Empire in 1860. So, except for the nationalists in like civil society, who were these voices of democracy? Because it's interesting for me because nationalists usually use these voices for like not for the freedom itself, but for like some kind of political strategy. Like Peter Judson and Tara Zara like propose this idea of national indifference. So in their view, I don't actually agree at all, but it's like I think it's important to emphasize that sometimes nationalism is like a political strategy, and these voices of freedom, these voices of democracy, they are manipulative in their cases. So except for them, maybe who were these people, like except for nationalists? That's like my whole question.
Thank you. Now, if one looks, takes this from the mid-19th century, particularly 1848, Democrats were labeled as being the left-wing radicals. You have liberals, and you have conservatives, moderates, and you have Democrats, and you have some very minor group of communists. So not everyone who is a liberal in 1848 would have conceived of himself as a Democrat, because that was sort of the radicalized version. Now the voices we know from 1848 are mostly those voices which we can hear in these printed leaflets. Everybody could go and sort of print a leaflet, or and it is quite obvious that this most peasants wouldn't go and have a leaflet printed. So mostly it is people who have an urban background, who can read and write, we don't really know, or at least I don't really know how much it would have cost in 1848 to print a leaflet, but it can't have been that expensive because there's so many of them popping up very quickly. We don't see any price tags on these leaflets, so we don't know whether they're being sold as an economic enterprise. Then they would have been addressed sort of to an audience that would have been willing to pay a shilling or whatever or so for it, or they're simply being printed because it came from an internal desire for them to be read out aloud and sort of make use of this sort of voicing one's political opinion. We do have the voices of people who compose resolutions, and we do have the voices of people who are elected to parliament, and that's where peasants, also peasant voices, come in, even though many deputies, and the most famous one in 1848 is the Czech or Bohemian-born German Hans Kudlich, who pushed for peasant emancipation. So it's not the full spectrum. Now what I was trying to argue is quite along the lines of what you mentioned, even though you said you don't fully side with it. That is Peter Judson and Tara Zara's notions that if nationalists are speaking out loud, that this is not an indication of strong nationalism, but it's an indication of weak nationalism. And I think if you see the, I quoted it several times, the Ruthenian intellectuals, let's call them, calling out, trust us, I think this is a very clear sign that they knew that they were speaking to people to whom it was not natural to trust them, to put it like this. And if one looks at the way peasants in Galicia, both Ukrainian peasants in the east and Polish peasants further to the west, had reacted to the noble uprising in 1846, you can quickly see that most peasants in the mid-19th century in this region were not very open to nationalist agitation, particularly when it came from noble landholders whom they felt were their oppressors. So I do think that there is a point to Tara Zara, even though if she sort of looks at this not from the perspective of the rhetoric and tries to construct the situation from there, but postulating national indifference by saying what we hear from voices in the region here are the Tuteishi, the people from here, which is what ethnographers at the time did find. I think it does make quite some sense. But what I'm also trying to argue is that nationalism is not a strategy sort of to distort people from true democracy. It's a way of understanding by activists that this was what they needed to do if they wanted to win over larger populace for how they understood what democracy was about. Or to say it a bit more clearly, or maybe more theoretically, changing from a monarchical order to a constitutional order is rethinking the body politic. The Austrian Imperial Parliament was dissolved the very moment when it put forth rights by saying the sovereign are the people. That's when the ministry stepped in and say, no, that's not what we promised. We promised constitutionalism, but the sovereign is still the monarch. And that's when it was dissolved. And the question is, who are the people? And in a rhetoric where even the emperor speaks to the people as the peoples of the monarchy, it is quite clear that if one wants to have some sort of political representation of peoples in parliament, you have to sort of speak to your constituency in a way that sort of puts this thinking into practice. So you have to build, to transform the populace into peoples, into nations, so as to be able to adapt to constitutionalism. So I think there is a strong link between nationalism and democracy in this early phase, even though it, in the trajectory of a century and even more, nationalism and democracy are uneasy bedfellows, so to speak. That was a very long answer to, I think, a very important question.
Thank you very much.
But there was, yeah.
So okay, I actually have two comments. So the first comment is directly related to what we have been talking about. So it's about these times of these revolutions, and what I am interested in is these pan-Slavic ideas. So, for example, during the 1848 revolutions, we have this Congress of Slavs in Prague, where different Slavic people of the Austrian Empire met in order to discuss their national programs and to create some kind of common program. And also some years before this Congress, we have in Ukraine Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, that is also a pan-Slavic organization of Ukrainians. And of course, Ukrainians were at the core of this organization, but they intended to create the confederation of all the Slavic state, which should be democracies. And then in the 20th century, we have these universals of Ukrainian Central Council, and they basically, almost all of them, first three of them were about being in a federation or confederacy with the democratic Russia. And it made me think why it was so much about aligning with other Slavs, especially in the 19th century. It seems that these Slavs, and Ukrainians in particular, were feeling as if they do not have a strong enough voice in order to actually fight for this democratic state in any kind of form, so they are trying to find these allies somewhere outside. And the next remark is more about the beginning of the 19th century, and it is about a pre-modern democracy. And I study the memoirs of the Polish soldiers of the Napoleonic army, and while studying this, I used one theory proposed by Brian Porter. He actually studied the Polish national democracy, but he actually made a very interesting remark that in the beginning of the 19th century, the Polish nation was constituted by action, because of course Polish nation was only nobility and gentry, not the peasants, of course. But when there is no Polish state, these noblemen had to actually somehow constitute their nation by doing something. For example, fighting in the army, being part of the state apparatus, etc. And a lot of these gentries actually chose to collaborate with the partition powers. So in this case, we see how in the beginning of the 19th century, they are the only voice of the Polish nation, or what they consider to be the Polish nation, and not these other ones. And about the democracy, one of these core noble values were freedom. Like this noble freedom of the Polish gentry, which was really important. And what is interesting in that case, they also contrasted the Polish freedom of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with the Russian tyranny. It is very prominent. And yeah, even some informants of Napoleon, which were also Polish, they really accentuated on the fact that Russia is a tyranny. So yeah, these are my comments, and I really hope to hear your opinion on that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. These are also two very important aspects of the topic. Thank you. Pan-Slavism, first of all, I would say is as much a political sort of bogeyman to German politicians as it is to, and you read more in German literature about the dangers of Pan-Slavism than as a programmatic, in the 19th century, as a really programmatic program. If you ask where did it come from, and this need to join, I would argue, and this is more or less in line with standard literature, that it comes from Slavic mutuality as a cultural movement in the early 19th century, going all the way back to Johann Gottfried Herder, and his understanding of the coming age of humanity and education being the age of the Slavs, because they are so peaceful and humane and non-belligerent, as in his writings the Germans were. Having come from Riga, I think he sort of partly knew what he was talking about. So he had an experience with the region. Now the question why this notion of Slavic mutuality did not translate into a democratic Pan-Slavism, I think has very much to do with the what I mentioned earlier, namely with the perception, first of all, that much of this mutuality is addressed to what has for a long time and in a problematic way been addressed to small Slavic nations, which is Czechs, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Ukrainians, and not so much to Russians, and maybe Poles. You can read nearly everywhere where the early 19th century is being addressed that the Polish understanding of a free nation fully clashed with the experience of the partition, even though you have noblemen like Czartoryski who sort of were trying to think or even act their way out of this polarity. If I'm not mistaken, the only Russian present in Prague was Bakunin, Mikhail Bakunin. Not precisely an embodiment of Russian tyranny at the time. Before it sort of fully came to an end, it was shelled by the Austrian military. But the question of how one could translate Slavic mutuality into a political, constitutional program along Austro-Slavic lines, but not limited to the Habsburg monarchy, but including a restored Polish state, and maybe even Russia was sort of cut short before it could be fully spelled out. The overwhelming understanding, as I was trying to argue, that Russia, as Hungarians were quick to find out, and there was lots of German rhetoric behind this as well, found that Russia is the seat of tyranny, was, I mean, with Nicholas I still in power, was quite easy to argue along these lines rather than appealing to not so well-known Decabrist programs of constitution. But the question, I think one can trace this, is always there. It's not just simply projecting or thinking of Russia as a space of tyranny, but also trying to think one's way out of this in saying, how could we resolve this situation? And people, or various voices since the 19th century, come to the same conclusion, which I would actually say we shouldn't even abandon today. So the only hope we have is for Russia, for a democratic transformation in Russia, as unlikely as this might seem, and maybe even naive after 1.5 centuries of sort of hoping for it. But it is one of the ways of sort of trying to think along different trajectories rather than sort of thinking of either sort of fighting down Russia to the very end or simply living with the tyranny next door.
You have a question. Yes.
Can I interrupt just a bit, because I have two small comments on what Alexander said actually. So the first idea is your first example is about the pan-Slavistic nature of Cyrillic-Lithuanian unity. And actually, yes, I agree that they were pan-Slavistic. However, I guess that it was not pan-Slavistic unities kind of the second half of the 19th century, but actually they were romanticist actually. And they were inspired by some examples of Czech and Polish nationalistic ideas, first of all Czechs, actually. And if we look into the Kniha bytia Ukraińskiego Narodu, which was actually directly inspired by the Polish analog, we can see that Ukrainians thought about themselves. Ukrainians, of course, the main figures like Kulish or Kostomarov, and kind of that. As they thought about themselves as messianic figures. So Ukrainians are slaves. They are among other nations. However, they were never been fought. They were never been slaves by someone else. They did not have any pani for someone else. So, and this is why Ukrainian nation was and is, according to the Mayans, the most democratic nation, and therefore it should be the first. So it's not this pan-Slavistic idea like in the second half of the 19th century, as I said before. And the second example of Oksana, you're talking about this idea of federation between Ukraine and Russia in the universal. However, actually, the idea of the total independence of Ukraine was never a burning point till the, I guess, the very 1980s. And I don't think actually that it happened because of the lower voice of Ukrainians, but because of the difference in the understanding of what independence is, or what Ukraine actually should have had. Because Ukrainians were fighting for the cultural differences and some cultural representation for a lot of years, and they were talking about some linguistic issues, or for example the culture, the opportunity to represent themselves, and it was more important at that time than some political independence, and I guess that political independence was very weird for them. This very idea was very weird, and therefore it didn't have many supporters. So even though in this Ukrainian movement only a very small group of independents, like people who liked Mikhail Mikhalovsky, they were independent, but they were quite radical and nobody liked them. So it was really a few people, and most of them, they were federalists, of course, because they were talking about democracy, but democracy in some kind of in this kind of borders of the Russian Empire, because the burning point was this cultural difference, I guess. Sorry.
Thank you. The first part was, I think, actually
Sure.
more common to your colleague. As to the second, I would largely agree that one should not project the idea of independence as it was spelled out under duress in early 1918, projected back as the original aim that had been there from the beginning. I would go along with you that it's more about federalism. But I would slightly disagree in saying it's mostly Ukrainian democratic nationalism is mostly about a cultural understanding, because I've been, in my understanding from what I read, once the February Revolution had taken place, Ukrainians in the Central Rada, Khrushchevsky in particular, they understood that now it's also about control of the institutions. That simply sort of going for a cultural nation-building elevation program would not be enough, that things were changing very quickly, very rapidly, and that they should not be organized along guberni, but in a broader sort of, now was the time to build a broader Ukrainian commonality, institutional commonality among the different now democratic, within this democratic empire. But that amounts basically to a federal idea. I would just say it's a little bit more political and institution oriented than just cultural oriented.
I guess I was talking, it was important for them even at that time, because for Khrushchevsky and other main figures, actually the idea of this linguistic opportunities and cultural opportunities and the opportunities of Ukrainian movement as itself was even more important than some economic issues. And it is considered to be one of the reasons why actually Bolsheviks won this ideological persuading of the people, some kind of propaganda and some kind of persuading the peasants that Bolshevik idea was more unnecessary for them, because Ukrainians were talking about the Ukrainianization as a first issue, and the Bolsheviks were talking about some economic issues and kind of that, about this taking the ground and giving it for the people. And what I was also mentioning is actually if we see into the very idea of principle who Ukrainians were, that actually for this first Ukrainian government, actually the idea of this unity of the common living and also language and also some common history was really important. So for them, this cultural difference was really important issues even during this first half.
But that is, if I may quickly respond, I think that is where this difference between is this value driven or is it situational becomes very important. In my understanding, what is happening in central and eastern Ukraine is not so different from what happens on the Volga and in central Russian regions. Namely that the Bolsheviks promise the peasants take things into your own hands. And if established institutions, weak as they are, fall apart, the better. So the notion both of the February Revolution, that is the Russian liberals or even Mensheviks, and of the Ukrainian, I mean they were all socialists, agrarian socialists more or less, and Democrats as such, they were sort of not as radical in saying let us encourage peasants to take things into their own hands, but they were thinking along the lines of trust those weak local institutions which we have, and let's make them Ukrainian institutions while they were already being swept away. And that appeal to the peasants to wait a few weeks for institutions to be strong enough to enact reforms and to channel this and do things in a responsible way. That time wasn't there. I would say Lenin's strength is in being radically irresponsible in spite of an ongoing war. He did everything which a responsible politician who wants to win that war would avoid, and actually in Brest-Litovsk he had to pay the consequences. You can see this experience sort of mirrored in what is happening in Czechoslovakia, in Romania, in Poland, partly also in Hungary before the Soviet Revolution, is that people were quite aware that this was a race against time, as I said, and that's also why I chose this quote from a Czech politician saying, "We need the strong institutions of a democratic state to do things right now." Only that the bureaucracy that they could build on, and they had to build new institutions as well. That's details I won't go into. Were much stronger and much more efficient than the imperial, powerful but not really strong institutions which existed in the Russian Empire.
Please, that is here and then here. And then here.
Yeah, there's voices from the courtyard, so if you speak up.
Right, sorry. Yes?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I will jump into this conversation with my predictable and easy question. It's not even questions, rather. Thank you. Does it work? Works? Okay. So it's not even questions, rather clarification, let's say, of your comment on this concept of democracy that should mature, I believe, something like that. So we'll make this move from 18th century to our independence period. And I was wondering, does this process of maturing should be man-made, like, I mean, committed by people who do this on purpose, or should it be like more nature, like those generations that are changing? So which type of way this maturing will take in our future, if it will take, of course. So my question is, clarification was this. Yes,
thank you. And thank you also for taking the microphone, not just for my sake, but for the sake of the recording. What I'm trying to say is that the problem is not that democratic institutions are there and good, and it's people who have to get used to them and culturally adapt to them and fill them with content, so to speak, but that it makes a difference whether these institutions are at the very beginning new, promising, and so on, or whether they have been running for sort of a certain time. And of course, it's all man-made to that extent. And what I'm trying to argue here is, the first thing is that we should not think of certain people not being mature for democracy, because democracy has started to work with people who were sort of blatantly immature along these standards, and still it worked. If it's cut short in the mid-20s and again in the late 40s, these new beginnings are being cut short, and there's no time to accommodate this adjustment from something which is promisingly new versus which has been there for quite some time and needs to be rethought and reshaped over and over again. Then that doesn't attest to the immaturity of a people or a nation, but it has to be taken account of as a historical experience. And the final thing behind my comment is a current worry with the very defensive, even though I don't know a way out, the very defensive position which we all find ourselves in, even in the more let's say, established democracies of where I grew up, Western Germany. Since I can remember, it was always there and it always seemed to work. Or American or British or French democracy. I think if you look at it from a historian's perspective and you see how much society has changed, the way we think about political communication, particularly digitalization, but also the way we think differently now about the equality of sexes than we did, even though the promise has been there for quite some time, or other forms of emancipation. We all know that there is an enormous ambiguity in the American promise of democracy and equality of men made by people who were slaveholders, you know, and thinking about difference in and historic deprivation of rights along color of skin, thinking along these lines has also changed in the last 3 or 4 decades. And if democracy cannot accommodate such changes, it gets stuck into a golden period of, say, Western 1960s and 70s, let alone the demographic change. I can go on and on like this. So democracy, I would say, has to be able to adapt to changing social circumstances, and also to adapt to the fact that it cannot always live on promises for a better future to come. That is also one, maybe the most fundamental change we have now. We don't believe in progress anymore. And that is something which is not unique to Eastern Europe, but the promise of democracy comes with a thinking in a historical trajectory. Not as strict as the communist one, where building communism is something which will happen within a generation or so, but it has a teleology. And this teleology is sort of, no serious historian would go for teleologies anymore, and politicians neither. Adapting, and I would say, adapting democracy in a general Western and European perspective in a period where the West is certainly no longer on the rise, and is willing to see previous aspiration at global hegemony waning, democracy has to adapt to that sort of different way of thinking as well. And that is something which I think is a major challenge to American, British, German, Italian, and probably all of Western democracy. And maybe we see it in Western Europe more clearly because the promise that things are getting better if one gets more democratic is much more easily sort of to be made here than it is to be made, let's say, in France today.
We have one and then two, so we combine both.
Okay, thanks. So my question is about the term and maybe about the definition and perception. So liberal democracy. You use the term of liberal democracy in the middle of the 19th century, then after the World War I, and then like modern liberal democracy. And so, could you please define the meaning of the liberal democracy after the First World War? Who were the agents, how it was described, perceived and told to the people, and how the world would look like if it became like a liberal democracy. And it's like, it differs about who we're talking about. For example, like Polish advocates at the time, or maybe some kind of Ukrainians, or maybe others. So I would say it's your choice who are liberal democrats that you would like define and tell the agenda, but like we're talking about the Eastern Europe. And could you please compare it to the Bolshevism and also define the Bolshevism at the time? Who were the agents, I would say, who held power, and like what kind of world they imagined they would like to build? So kind of the comparison of the liberal democracy rhetoric and the Bolshevism rhetoric after the First World War.
Thank you.
Maybe you combine two.
Yeah, sure, if it goes in similar direction.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I would like to thank you for this extremely interesting lecture. And actually, I had two questions, but still, maybe I will proclaim just one. And my question is precisely about, so to say, a democracy clashes and during the First World War and after the First World War in Eastern Galicia, and about the national personal autonomy. So I think that maybe talking about democracy is also, maybe when we are talking about democracy, is also very important to remember that that we are talking about the different types of democracies in different times, because I think we have a wonderful opportunity to bring a very large question, because we really take a very, so to say, long time scope. Actually it also enables us to see it intertemporally, and maybe I think that, at least I think that it's also very important to talk about different types of democracy, and this democracy which is also combined with nationalism, and in Polish and in Ukrainian case. So also analyzing this transition, democratical transition, we also can say that we have a different understanding of democracy in the mid of 19th century, and we have a different understanding of the democracy in the interwar period. So it's, I would say, a different type of democracy, but actually it's also very important, I think, that this democracy actually gains in Polish case, actually in this case of this law and personal national personal autonomy. Yeah, so in Polish case it really gains an exclusivist understanding, and in Ukrainian case it's rather an open one. And why it's also very important, because we are talking about democracies very combined with a question of nationalism. And one of the, I think, most important traits of the Eastern European region is actually that it's very multi-ethnic. Yeah, and how you would maybe, I don't know, evaluate, or how you would maybe explain these differences in political culture, which actually clash and live in different national projects. In Ukrainian, one which actually implies that, yeah, okay, it's wonderful that we are living in Lviv, we have different people from different nations, so to say, yeah, from different ethnic backgrounds, but still we can combine them in one Western Ukrainian People's Republic. And in Polish case, we have, they claim it to be a democracy, yeah, but from, so to say, I don't know, maybe we can question also this, or understand that maybe it's a different type of democracy. Yeah, would you explain maybe this differences in political cultures that not erase, but that we have actually in these different projects, that Ukrainians say that, okay, we have a national personal autonomy, and Poles say that no, it's actually not that case that we can go in terms with. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. two, I think, very complex questions, going again directly to the heart of the matter. Now, to your question, at first, whom do I label as Democrats or take as democratic voices? As I mentioned earlier, not all revolutionaries of 1848 would have been happy if I labeled them as Democrats. That was why I was so happy for finding this quote of saying this is about constitutionalism with a democratic tendency. That's a voice from the time. I think historians always have to balance sort of their own normative understanding or sort of making a claim from the outside, features which along which they define their terms, and looking at the terms of the sources. Now, if we see, look at it from the 19th century, I would sort of more or less accept all the forces or the political voices that were calling for a constitutional control of the monarch, for popular participation in legislation, in politics, for expanding it, for expanding the suffrage, all the way into the moderate, maybe not too far into the conservative side, but into the moderate side as having democratic aspirations, particularly as long as they were linked to fundamental notions in constitutionalism, which are freedom of speech, which implies a minimum of pluralism, and rule of law, to which even conservative constitutionalists for defending property, at least, were quite strictly adhering to. Things become more complicated after World War I because you have two extreme new formations, communism and right-wing, let's call it fascism for this purpose, which both, for some way or the other, incorporate democracy into their own rhetoric, but no longer thinking along the lines of pluralism and so on. So if you think about Soviet democracy, popular democracy, as it is being called, and so on, is a claim to democracy, to true democracy or full democracy, and so on, which is not, which is challenging core democratic understandings. Now, what I could do is interpret this as a struggle for the interpretation of democracy, not taking sides at all. But since I'm trying to argue that one should not overlook the social promises linked to democracy, I can't really fully go along this line, but I have to make a sort of a certain claim to what I label as democratic or not democratic, and pluralism and basic rights of the citizens, I would say, and rule of law are core features which, if they're not accepted, but if there's a vision of an organic whole, sort of shaping the will of the people being articulated only from one position, and revolutionizing the populace along, even labeled it democratic, but fundamental cultural renewal, be it the revolutionary new man on the communist side or the revolutionary renewal of the fascist pangenetic understanding, as you would say, that I would say is beyond what I would call the democratic scope. So, since I'm trying to argue, don't simply look at institutions and party systems, but look at the precise historical situation. I somehow have to balance this difference. Now, as to your question, I didn't really go deeply into the question whether what do you call it, personal autonomy would have been a solution to some of the national problems in the region. This has been discussed for at least a generation, maybe two. I think it has been discussed more heatedly in the 1990s and 2000s than it is currently being discussed. particularly since it doesn't really look as if we have good models how this could work in practice successfully. When I was a student, one could look at Lebanon and saying, this is where it works. Now I'm hesitant to say anything works in Lebanon because the state seems to be really falling apart, and partly because of this understanding. What we do see is that this sort of personal autonomy, and that's a discussion on the Habsburg monarchy, which goes back to I think the most prominent person who featured this was Gerald Sturz in Vienna, a legal historian, in saying what we do see is that the thinking along national lines is getting stronger and stronger the more you go for personal autonomy. Particularly if you compare the Austrian side of the monarchy with the Hungarian side. The Hungarian experience, that's what I learned from my own research, is sort of more aggressive in claiming everyone for the Hungarian nation, but in doing so it is sort of naturally, I would say logically, less out for institutionalizing differences which may not, in everyday life, which may not have been on people's minds in any case. That is sort of having huge clashes in small communities on whether a child is truly a Czech child or a German child and which school it should go to. That's a discussion which you don't have in Hungary. There you have the question is, it's very clear which school it goes to. The question is which language is this school teaching in. So that goes in a rather different direction. I am very careful about making a distinction between ethnic and civic nationalism because I think if one looks at historical experience in the 19th and 20th century, it doesn't really work. Maybe in Switzerland, but if you look at France, if you look at Britain, even if you look at how distinction between the cultural nation and the civic nation comes up, in Germany it's Friedrich Meinecke, who's one of the first thinkers. State, nationalism directed towards the state, nationalism directed towards culture. He sees it as two sides of the same thing, and I think that's basically what it is about, even though in understandings of citizenship, for example, of how can you become an American citizen or a German citizen or a Polish citizen throughout the 19th and early, or even way into the late 20th century, now it's a bit different. But you can see a difference between these two notions, but if you look at how people think about what their nation is actually about, you would, even in Renan's Plébiscite de tous les jours, you find that it's actually about claiming Alsace-Lorraine back for France, even though the people don't speak French in their everyday to the extent that Renan would want them to. So you see an element of linguistic nationalism even there. And I think it's actually about having a plébiscite de tous les jours elsewhere as well. The notion of whether nationalism and a democracy are, as I said, uneasy bedfellows. I see a very, very clear link in the early 20th century and in the middle of the 20th century between the two, and I would hesitate to divide them apart. But of course, it's impossible not to overlook that there are different trajectories and that there's a large part of nationalist thinking which leaves its democratic origins far, far behind in the late 19th and throughout the 20th century.
Okay, we are running out of time, but I'd like to have maybe the last question, which is related to current events. Recently, the European institutions declared that the Russian Federation is the Russian Federation needs to be de-imperialized. Yes, so that this is not the federation. This is not really the institution which can reform itself. So some steps should be taken. And especially because of this genocidal war against Ukraine. On the other side, we have Viktor Orban, who proclaimed the far-right coalition in Europe. In the light of what you said, like, you know, post-1848, 180 years later, what this story tells us, the current story, and about democracy and about this Russian other and the European democracy.
Thank you. Starting with Viktor Orban, he proclaimed the illiberal state, which has then been translated into illiberal democracy as the exclusive way of organizing a state that can compete with others in global competition. It's explicitly non-liberal, that's why he calls it illiberal, because his only understanding of liberal freedom is that individuals sort of act along their own individualistic interests without having the whole thing in mind. Now you could sort of bring up a whole library of liberal thinking of how individualism and the society can fit together and don't necessarily sort of contradict each other. But I don't think Viktor Orban is for a liberal philosophical debate when he says so. It's against. It's rather about rejecting a certain model of which he sort of builds up of what Western liberalism is about, and it's no how to say. It's no surprise that he sooner or later ended up with some anti-Semitic slander and anti-LGBT diversity issues. That's one thing. The other thing you're hinting at is the call, which I also find very strong in the field of East European history, for Russia's need to de-imperialize or decolonize. I think it's a very strong case that can be made, but I also have the impression that if we narrow down what we expect from Russia to this, it must decolonize. We are overlooking and not fully reflecting the failures of democratic transformation in Russia, particularly in the period between 1905 and 1917, but also during the Perestroika period. This might be a bit too much colored, my remark, by debates I have with colleagues in Germany who are arguing along these lines and saying there's not much to be expected both from the Russian February Revolution and from Perestroika, because they were still imperialist-minded. And I say, yes, that's true. I won't argue against this, but they did not. That's not the reason why they failed. I would say there's much more within Russian society we need to look at and reflect about, and particularly also about the experiences of Bolshevism and Stalinism and the crimes or the mass violence, to put it this way, of Russians against Russians, which are even more disturbing about trajectories Russia might take after Putin's grip might loosen. I think it's now more or less precisely 1 year that the Prigozhin adventure sort of gave us a vague hint of what might happen in Russia if someone somewhat, maybe not credible but popular, stood up and challenged Putin along lines which were certainly not democratic and not to be welcomed. So my prospects for Russia are actually even more gloomy. And yet I am trying to insist, and that might be, you might experience this as a detached opinion of someone who does not have to go into a cellar every other week or day or whatever. But I still don't want to fully give up the hope of Russia taking a more positive democratic development, even though there's not very much showing in that direction as yet. So, yeah, let's leave it at that.
Thank you. This was Professor Joachim von Puttkamer and Voices of Democracy after 1848. So we thank you for this welcoming lecture.